So the session is going to be chaired by Mr. Vijay Arora. A marine engineer by profession, Mr. Vijay Arora started working as tool design engineer with the tractor harvester combined light commercial vehicle manufacturing company, a shore-based automobile industry. Later, he sailed with the Great Eastern Shipping Company for about 5 years. In 1990, he joined IRS. While in IRS, he has worked in various survey stations in India and abroad and has handled multiple responsibilities while heading the ship classification and certification, statutory and quality systems. Some of his key roles, contribution in international forums, include being a member of the IX statutory panel, being a chairman of the safety panel at IX, participating in International Maritime Organization for ship design and construction, for ship systems and equipments, for Maritime Safety Committee and Marine Environment Protection Committee. He has also participated in many IX meetings. Presently, he is the Joint Managing Director of Indian Register of Shipping. I would like to call on Mr. Vijay Arora to chair the session.
Thank you. Good morning to all of you. What my request is that if in case the people who are sitting behind, they can come forward, it will be better, because I think then the hall will be closer to the point of speech basically. So I'll request all of you to come a little forward. While the people who come later, they can keep taking the seats behind without disturbance. Now I request the speaker, Mr. Rob Cox, to kindly join me, Mr. Sanjeev Wazir and Mr. R.C. Bhavnani, please. Yeah. We have session on marine fuels and SOX compliance. And we have 3 speakers. The first speaker is Mr. Rob Cox, who is going to speak on refining fuel quality and operational considerations resulting from MARPOL Annexure 6. The second speaker, Mr. Sanjeev Wazir. He is from Marine Engine Lubrication 2020. Subject is this. And he's from Lukoil perspective. He's talking from that point of view. And Mr. R.C. Bhavnani is from Vishwa Labs, and he is going to speak on revolutionizing marine scrubber with Vishwa H scrubber. So I'll introduce Mr. Rob Cox. Mr. Rob Cox has over 25 years of international petroleum industry experience, including 15 years field experience in environmental aspects of refining, retail marketing and shipping, as an expatriate and Caltex, now Chevron in Africa, the Middle East and United States basically. Until recently, Rob was seconded to the position of Program Manager of IOGP, IPI ECA Joint Industry Project on Oil Spill Response, which was established to understand and implement the oil spill response lessons learned from 2010 Gulf of Mexico incident. Rob currently manages the IPI ECA Marine Issues Task Force, which is working with members, various stakeholders, and the International Maritime Organization in the lead up to the 2020 Global Sulfur Cap on marine fuels. Rob also holds a bachelor degree in chemistry and biochemistry from the University of Dundee in Scotland and postgraduate diploma in environmental practice from Farnborough College of Technology in England. Coming to the proceedings, basically what my plan is that I have introduced Mr. Rob now, so he'll be making his presentation, and subsequently as the speakers will go, I'll make their introduction basically. At the same time, my request to all the audience is that kindly note down the questions what you have against the speaker so that we can take all the questions at last when all the three speakers have made a presentation. Thank you. I'll request Rob, please.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. And it's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. This issue is really important. Okay. You are the people that can make the difference between this being a success or potentially a failure. All of us in this room have a shared responsibility to make sure that the transition to the new fuels regime is successful and as smooth as it can possibly be. There will be occasions when there are problems to be overcome. Technical problems, supply problems, but by and large, I can assure you, everybody is working hard to make sure that this transition is as smooth and as successful as it can possibly be. My job today, in this presentation and in the panel session this afternoon in particular, is to tell you about some of the things that I think you need to watch out for. But first, who am I and what is IPECA? IPECA is a global oil and gas association for environmental and social issues. It was formed in 1974 following the launch of UN Environment. And so we represent the oil companies, the refiners in particular, and it's the only global association involving both upstream and downstream. Those are some of our members. We have most of the members that you would expect to see, but surprisingly quite a few of the smaller members, and of course the regional associations.
I'll request people in the audience to
well.
keep silent basically because we can't hear basically, or maybe otherwise we have to close the door, so we can't hear otherwise properly.
So what are the 2020 compliance options? You could continue using high sulfur fuel oil with a scrubber. You could use 0.50% sulfur marine distillate or marine gas oil. You could use one of the newly formulated max 0.50% sulfur fuels. You could convert the vessel to LNG. What might you do? It might depend on the age of the vessels, the payback time for the scrubber installs, if it's physically possible. There are many scrubbers that will not fit into the machinery space available on the ship. The availability of chosen fuels on a typical route and your destination. Whether those routes include the emission control area, 0.1% sulfur fuel. The availability of segregated tankage on the vessel. That is an often overlooked factor, and it's one that I'll come back to both in this presentation and in the panel session this afternoon, where I'm hoping to show you a video that was prepared by one of our members, BP, on the potential effects of not being careful with segregation. And there are other factors as well. How big is this change? As a refiner, and I was a refiner at one stage, I look at it in the way of how difficult was it in terms of refining capability, capacity, and the amount of sulfur that you have to remove from fuels in terms of the volume, in terms of the quantity, to, for example, introduce low sulfur fuels for road transport in Europe. And you can see that there. How difficult was it to do the ECA, the emission control area, in 2015? And how difficult will it be for the global cap, the global sulfur cap in 2020? It's not one order of magnitude bigger, it's many orders of magnitude. The slide illustrates how important the additional sulfur recovery will be to allow the transition from making high sulfur residual fuels to making 0.50% sulfur fuels for the full marine market. It compares the change in terms of the additional amount of sulfur to be removed from refinery streams in terms of the amount of effort, the hydrogen plant that you have to employ, the sulfur plant. It's going to be difficult. It's difficult for refiners, and refiners are already investing billions of dollars in upgrading their equipment. For those of you not familiar with refiners, I've got this diagram here that shows 3 different types of refineries. All refineries are at least the basic type that's shown here without any color in it. Very simple refineries. We find a lot of these in Africa, for example. And they don't have a lot of complexity and they don't have a lot of conversion capacity. The refineries in India tend to be more complex and more sophisticated, very sophisticated in some cases. They will have additional conversion, catalytic cracking, alkylation, etc., shown in green there. And they can make and segregate higher volumes of vacuum gas oil, which is what will be required for the new marine market to make MGO and MDO. And then finally, the additional high conversion processing. There aren't many of those type of refineries around the world that have cokers and are able to have essentially 0 residual fuel production, where everything goes through to either vacuum gas oil or distillate and the other fractions. So depending on the country that you visit, the type of marine fuel market that you experience will be different from one country to another. Some of the refining changes that are needed, either increased coker units, if you have a coker, increased vacuum unit throughputs, shifting fuel, fluid FCCU, fluid catalytic cracking feedstock, from vacuum gas oil to resid. That can lead to increased emissions, regulatory constraints, increased severity on desulfurization and hydrocracking units, turning up the volume, substantial increases in hydrogen and sulfur recovery plant load. It's not insignificant, between 2 and nearly 5% increase in greenhouse gas emissions predicted because you use more crude and more energy. You boil more oil to make a higher quality product. And this is sometimes lost and forgotten as we talk about the air pollution benefits of removing sulfur from fuel. Individual refineries will make their own decisions on which approach they take. Refinery challenges and opportunities will vary, and the markets will vary. So those decisions are going to be made individually. And one of the things that I said last week in the Marine Environment Protection Committee meeting is to stress to people that refiners are not able to collude and to get together and say, well, I'm going to supply this much fuel of this quality in Mumbai, and I'll do this much on the west coast of the United States or in the UK, and how about I swap with you and we'll sort of agree to do this here and that there. It's not possible because it contravenes anti-competition law known as antitrust in the United States. And it doesn't matter that you're not in the United States or competition law in Europe, it doesn't matter. As soon as you set foot in those countries, you're in jail. It is absolutely a criminal offense to engage in anti-competitive behavior. The individual refineries cannot, despite the calls for it and despite the fact it would be really convenient if we all knew how much product and of what quality would be available, it absolutely is not legal for the refiners to collude in providing that information. It's unfortunate, but we are where we are. The way to do this, of course, is to lock in those contracts, and many ship operators and owners and operators are doing exactly that, making sure that they assure themselves of the supply of the fuels they need in the future. I'm going to speak a little bit more about fuel stability and compatibility because it's important. In fact, I believe it's at the heart of this debate. Availability will sort itself out during 2020, but the principles of fuel stability, compatibility will not change. Fuel stability is the potential for fuel to change condition in storage and depending on its resistance to break down or to remain stable and not to segregate. More important perhaps is fuel compatibility, which is the tendency of fuels to produce deposits when mixed. And if you attend the panel session this afternoon, I've got an absolutely superb video, if we're able to show it technically, from BP on what happens if you mix paraffinic and equal quantities of paraffinic and aromatic VLSFO. There's some rules and good practices, and I appreciate that you may not have onboard tankage, you may not have the actual segregation ability to segregate. So this is why passage planning, fuel planning, and hopefully as part of the ship implementation plan that the IMO is putting in place is absolutely critical. Avoid mixing bunker fuels from different sources where you can. It's not really possible because as ship moves around, it's not like you're filling up at it's not like a car where you tend to fill up at the same service station every week. Store fuels separately until compatibility testing has been carried out, preferably before you even need to store them at all. Don't mix straight run fuel oil, the product of atmospheric or vacuum distillation that is, with a cracked one. If not possible, keep the ratio to a minimum, 90 to 10, 10 to 90, as opposed to 50-50. Don't mix fuels with greatly dissimilar densities. Don't mix fuels with greatly dissimilar viscosities. And don't mix a marine fuel oil with a marine diesel oil or marine gas oil. When you put it into the tank, it may be a single homogeneous product at 0.50% sulfur, but over time, as it's heated and it jiggles and shakes, you may find it segregating into fuels that are unusable. The future marine fuel mix will likely be met by a mix of components, distillates, low sulfur residuals, and new fuel oil formulations as the market responds and new streams are introduced. Fuels that we haven't seen before. But there are places where we have seen them before. And that is the CARB, that's the California Air Resources Board implementation in California, and the emission control area implementation in Europe. That's provided some useful case studies of the operational challenges on changing over from high sulfur fuel oil use to MDO or MGO. You're going to see both low sulfur blends, MGO, or possibly even 380 centistoke blend low sulfur fuels. You're going to see complex blends of residuals and distillates. You're going to see fuels that are more aromatic, and you're going to see fuels that are more paraffinic, and you're going to see a range. That has several consequences. The consequence is that you're going to need to demand more information from the fuel supplier, but for you, that is going to mean that you have to become fuel experts. Okay? You're going to have to be aware and get educated, and we're going to provide you with that education and that support in order to understand what it is you're getting and how it reacts or might not react or might react with the fuel that you already have on board. This is going to be a shared responsibility between the fuel supplier and the fuel user. So what is the International Maritime Organization doing? They've developed and the final things were approved at the meeting last week in London. 3 sets of fuel quality guidelines. Guidelines for fuel purchasers and users, guidelines for suppliers, and guidelines for member states, such as India. Okay? These are very basic, very generic guidelines. They're useful, but they're not the end of the story. So what is industry doing? Well, it was noted during the CARB implementation in California and the ECA in Europe that changing over from high sulfur fuel oil to MDO and MGO distillates can cause a significant number of leaks, pump seals, pressure gauge connections, flanges, filter covers, etc. And there's going to need to be a lot of operational oversight on things like fuel switching. There were blackouts during that CARB implementation. There were concerns raised at the Marine Environment Protection Committee, which included issues that could potentially increase the safety risks to ships. It's all about safety. It's going to be important for you to make sure that you have adequate information on the potential risks, and we need to make sure that those potential risks are made available to you, such as you can take appropriate action. So we're working, as IPECA, we're working with the Oil Companies International Marine Forum to put in place guidance that addresses the impact on fuel and machinery systems resulting from the new blends or fuel types, and provides guidance It's interesting. And provides guidance on the handling, storage, and use of such fuels. So consequently, we've agreed to develop a guidance document, and we've engaged with organizations such as CMAC, the International Fuels Association, the Energy Institute, and the International Standards Organization to carry out the task. And we're invited other interested parties, including end users, to join us. So included in that guidance, it's been very well received, both by the IMO and several delegations have nominated experts to contribute to this joint industry project effort. I'll talk a little bit more about that joint industry project in the panel session this afternoon. But basically, we have a terms of reference, we've started work on the guidance, and the target's going to be to have some guidance ready by the end of December for presentation in February. It'll be an outline guidance. The reason it can only be an outline at the moment is because the standards for the introduction of the fuels are still being developed by the International Standards Organization, for example. So we're going to use this to put in place training materials so that you'll have some training that you can roll out and will understand, how to prepare for January the 1st, 2020 and the use of distillate fuels. I'm not going to go into this slide in detail. Hopefully you'll get a copy of this, but basically there's some new standards coming out. ISO 8217 was revised in 2017, and the new guidance and the new revision of it will only be available mid-2020. But in the interim, there's a publicly available specification called a PAS 23263. That's going to address quality considerations that apply to marine fuels. So you're going to get a new set of specification. There are going to be new test methods. There's going to be all sorts of things. I wanted to highlight one issue that's available, that's becoming a bone of contention. It's going to be discussed in February at the IMO, and that is when it is 0.5 really 0.5. And at the moment, the way that the discussion is going is that you will have to produce fuel to 0.44 in order to assure yourself that the fuel, because of the variability and statistical deviation, is actually lower than 0.5. We think that's unfair. We think it's not in line with ISO specifications and standards for sampling. And we have made representations to the IMO for that. But it would really help if the individual countries, such as India and the state delegations, actually shared that and put pressure on the IMO to make sure that the ISO specifications are used for sampling. So that's a plea from me. So it's going to be discussed further at PPR6 in February. So to wrap up, what's the landscape for low sulfur fuel? Marine fuel going into 2019. We need to work together. For sure we need to work together. We're collaborating as IPECA and OCIMF with the shipping industry associations on this document and on the training materials on specifications, safety and product handling. But it's going to need a real investment of time and effort from you as ship owners and operators and associations and as people who are interested in marine fuel and marine safety to make sure that this whole transition is carried out safely. Together with the workshops that we're holding and events like today where we're speaking, this should help to educate stakeholders on the potential for incidents. So just to finish off, this isn't going anywhere. This is going to happen. The IMO decision is firm and final. We still get people saying to us, well, you must tell them, we're not ready, it's got to be postponed. It won't be postponed. The future level of scrubber penetration, pre and post 2020, remains a great uncertainty factor. It was not a great start. There's been a lot of pickup in the announcement of scrubbers to remove sulfur lately, but there's little time left for that. We need to be thinking about completing the preparations for 2019 around about of 2020, round about mid 2019. That's tight. We're developing new specifications with ISO and CMAC. There's new test methods about compatibility, and I'll mention that in the panel session, also under development. But all the actors need to work together. Shipping, refining, fuel suppliers, we all need to be engaged on fuel quality, management, handling, safety and operation. There are good experiences to be learned from the US in particular, the US West Coast ECA experience. That is vital to understand what you need to know. And we'll be speaking about that in the panel session. Thank you very much.